So today, on the issue of facilities, we have Eric Bruner. He's a professor of economics and policy and also program director of the MPA and MPP programs at the Department of Public Policy at the University of Connecticut. His primary fields of research are state and local public finance and the political economy. We also have Jeffrey Vincent. He's deputy director and co-founder of the Center for Cities and Schools at the University of California, Berkeley. Jeff has a PhD in city and regional planning from Berkeley. His policy and research interests lie at the intersection of land use planning, community development, and educational improvement, with a particular focus on how school facilities serve as educational and neighborhood assets. On the topic of special education, we have Paul Warren. He's a research associate at the PPIC, where he focuses on K-12 education, finance, and accountability. Before he joined PPIC, he worked for the Legislative Analyst's Office for more than 20 years. His primary area of focus was education policy. And then on the topic of pensions, we have Dr. Corey Codell. He's an associate professor of economics and public policy at the University of Missouri. His research is in the areas of teacher quality and compensation, curriculum evaluation, school choice, and the efficacy of higher education institutions. So with that, we'll introduce Eric Bruner and Jeffrey Vincent, who are going to walk you through their research and getting down to facts as it relates to facilities.
All right, so we decided to go in descending order of depressing. So in this paper, we asked 4 fundamental research questions about school facilities. First one was, how has the level of school facility funding in California changed over time, and how does it compare to other states? Second is, how is school facility funding distributed across districts? So an equity question there. And then perhaps most importantly, if there are disparities in school facility funding, are they systematically related to wealth, income, and characteristics of districts? I'm not going to talk about the last issue, which was how is facility funding for charter schools doing in California. Okay, so this is real per capita infrastructure spending in California in 2016, and this is all the way from 1970 up to the present. And what you see here is a clear picture that there's some pretty erratic changes in school facility funding over time. So that's one of the big lessons we're going to learn, is that school facility funding tends to be a little bit unpredictable. But a lot of it's tied to political events, like Prop 13. We cut off their funding for a bunch of years, goes down, up. We take it out of Prop 13, goes up. We have the big early 2000s funding increases, and especially Prop 39, which lowered the vote requirement. We have a soaring of funding, the Great Depression, and we're right back down, going to hill. But this big downhill that I want to point out is related to 2 big events. One is that we stopped issuing state-level K-12 bonds, right? So for a whole long slice, no state funding, or at least no new state funding. And the second is the housing crisis, right? You have the housing crisis, what happens to developer fees? They dry up. Okay, so you had 2 of the 3 legs of school facility funding basically falling through at that period. Okay. How do we compare to other states? So this is why I'm a happy person. We used to really suck. So when I wrote this report 10 years ago, we looked bad, right? But because of that big uptick I showed you through the 2000, we're pretty much caught up. So this is California per capita, and this is the rest of the United States, right? And matter of fact, we look pretty reasonable to almost all the other big states, including our neighbors. And matter of fact, given that our growth rate between 2005 and 2006 was actually negative, right, which is one of the big impacts on school facility, we look actually pretty good, right, on that level. So in a national comparison, we're doing okay. All right, so where does revenue for school facility funding come from? As I said, it's really 3 sources are the vast majority of it. Local general obligation bonds voted in by local voters, state aid, which comes from statewide voter-approved GO bond issues, and finally developer fees, right? And the thing I want to point out here is that if we look between 2007 and 2015, no new statewide bonds were issued. As a result, relative to 10 years prior, state aid went from 29 to 13, right? So $1 billion. So it plummeted, right? At the same time, we had the Great Recession, which basically led to a decline in housing starts. $10 billion for the first 10-year period, the new period, $3.6 billion. What does it all imply? That all implies that funding went down by about 27 percentage points, right? And more importantly, because you're going to see in a minute, what that also implies is that most of the money nowadays is coming from local GO bonds instead of other sources. And of course, these are voter approved and funded through the property tax. And that's going to have implications for what's been happening with equity. Okay, and that brings me to equity. So what I'm showing you here is the distribution of revenue for school facility finance. Let's just focus on unified since they make up the majority of students. These are percentiles. So 10% of students attended a district where total facility funding over the entire 10-year period per pupil was $563. And 10% of students attended a district where total facility funding per pupil over the entire 10-year period was almost $15,000, right? So there are giant disparities in local geo bonds, and those led to very big disparities in total revenue, right? Mostly driven by the distribution of local revenue. So that's the first part of the story. The second part of the story is, are these differences I just showed you systematically related to wealth, income, etc.? Okay? And before I get into wealth, income, etc., I want to show you one picture, which is, hey, these are geo bonds and for facilities. One thing they should be highly related to is need. And the best measure, unfortunately, we have of need is enrollment growth, right? And if you look at it, it is related to enrollment growth. These are quintiles, so 20% of kids were in this one, 20% of kids were in this one, etc. And you know, the places with the highest enrollment growth got more money. But it isn't that big a difference. Right? We're not seeing that large a difference. So need as measured by revenue, by enrollment growth isn't explaining much of the disparities that I just showed you. It's got to be something else. So what is the something else? Well, there's the picture with income, right? So if you look at the picture with income, it's a clear monotonic relationship, right? The highest income districts, 20% of the richest districts in California, are raising about $17,000. 20% of the poorest districts are raising about $9,000 per kid over a 10-year period. This is not annual, this is over the 10-year period. Okay. This is what it looks like with assessed value. So this is the value of property, which is the funding source, right? Because this is what we attach our tax rates on. These are the 20% of districts with the highest property wealth, right? They raised about $18,000 per kid relative to about $9,000 or $7,000 at the other end of the spectrum. Okay, so big disparities by income and property wealth. Not surprisingly, that's going to translate into disparities based on disadvantaged students. So this is quintiles of disadvantaged students. You can think about this as poverty. And as you can see, those with the fewest kids in poverty raise the most money. Those with the most kids in poverty are raising the least money, right? Same story then, as you might imagine, it's going to go by race, right? Because they're correlated with income and it's correlated with disadvantaged students. Kids with the most non-white kids have raised the least over this 10-year period. Okay? So the bottom line is there's disparities and they're highly related to property wealth, income, and the demographic characteristics of districts. Implications for California. We find these large disparities, and I just want to point out why these large disparities are rising, or at least why Jeff and I think they are. This is the quintiles of assessed value per pupil. Okay, so this is property wealth. And if you look right here, what you're seeing is that in California, property wealth is highly correlated with the demographic characteristics of students. Places with the lowest property wealth, average income is about 45 grand. Places with the highest property wealth, median income is about 75 grand, right? And then of course that translates into difference between poor. 75% of kids in the lowest wealth districts are poor. Only 45% of kids in the highest wealth districts are poor. And then of course translates into differences in race and et cetera, et cetera. So the distribution of property wealth, which is what drives local geo bonds in the first place, is highly correlated with the demographic characteristics of districts in a way that disadvantages disadvantaged kids. Right? That's the bottom line here. And unfortunately, as you might know, the way we fund our state program is a first come, first served program. And in this case, what happens then is if you're a high wealth district, your voters, your tax price, the amount it costs you to raise money is low. So you just immediately say, yes, we'll vote yes, and you raise your bond money. Well, that means you're first in line. Right? So what happens? Well, this unfortunately is what happens. This is the distribution of modernization funding, which given California has a declining enrollment growth, or at least flat enrollment growth, most of the money right nowadays is needed for modernization of schools. And the point I want to make here is, here's the first quintile of state aid for modernization. And in that one, average assessed value of districts was $912 million, I guess what? It's quadruple that in the places that are getting the most state aid, right? So the highest assessed value districts are getting the most state aid. State aid, in other words, is regressive in California when it comes to modernization funding. And that, of course, because I just showed you that assessed values are correlated with the characteristics of kids, that means it's regressive along multiple dimensions. right? That's the issue. So a state aid program, which is supposed to be the equalizing force when we fund something through local property taxes, is actually leading to increased regressivity in the case of modernization funding in California. So this is why I'm now going down the sadder case, but nowhere near as much as these guys are. Okay, so here's just a little picture to give you an idea of the strong relationship between assessed value and the ability of local districts to raise money, right? It's just a straight monotonic relationship with the highest wealth districts being able to raise the most money. Okay, so finally, just some implications for California. Despite having invested a lot during the 2000s, K-12 facility needs remain high. That's both the fact of the age of our existing capital stock and the fact that we saw a 20% decline over the last 10 years. Two, the instability of state funding creates a funding challenge. Look at this. They never know where more money is going to come on, and therefore it's hard to plan, right? As I just showed you, local ability to raise funding varies very widely. And just get to this one. The other real big problem that Jeff and I have identified is, if you want to have a state system that makes some sense, it'd be really nice for the state to be able to target dollars where dollars are needed most. But in California, we don't have a school facility inventory system, at least not one that's very accurate, right? So we actually can't target money very well to where that money needs to go. Right? And a couple other things, but I think I'll stop there. Thank you. Did I make it?
You have 1 minute left. But we'll give that to Paul Warren. And remember, when all these presentations are done, we'll have a chance for Q&A. So Paul's going to talk to us about special education.
Go right past you on that. Close your eyes.
Oh, yours is so short, Cody. Okay, so we did a second report on special ed. Our first report came out in 2016, and looked at, and we call this revisiting special ed finance, because I go over many of the same issues that we talk about, and I try to provide a little more depth than what we provided in the first piece, and a few new issues as well. So I'm going to talk today about three things. One is the AB 602 formula, which is the primary source of special ed funding from the state to districts. Then talk about special ed preschool, and then just so you know that there are some other issues that we talk about in our piece, just to mention a few governance and accountability issues that are part of our paper. So just by way of background, I got my slides mixed up. So the bulk of money for special ed comes from districts. You can see here, districts supply about 60% of the funds. And that comes through their base funding that they get from the state for all students. 31% comes from the state in the form of the AB 602 formula, and 9% comes from the federal special education program. This is from 14-15. It's getting to be a little bit old, but it hasn't changed that much. So it's important to understand that district funding is based on overall student ADA in the district, not special education counts of students, but all students. So in some way, from a special ed standpoint, the money that comes from the state is fixed. No matter what your program costs are, no matter how many special ed kids you have, the amount that you get from the state from the state is fixed. So in the past 5 years or so, district costs for special ed have gone up a lot. There's an increasing number of kids who are being identified for services, but there's all these other district cost increases, like for staff, for wage hikes, for other kinds of services is also going up. And so, any kind of cost increase that happens at the local results in a higher share of costs for districts. And they have to pay that with local general fund money. So how do you address that problem? One group, at least, has proposed that maybe what we could do is take a subset of special ed kids whose problems are really pretty well medically defined, and say we're going to base special ed funding for those kids who tend to be high cost also, and base them on counts of special ed kids, and kind of get away from the ADA basis that that runs AB 602. And one of the things that holds out, however, is that AB 602 was designed this way in part because what it does is it creates no bias to identify more kids. And as a matter of fact, after 602 was enacted, the percent of kids in special ed did decline over the years. And so there'd be a concern that might, encourage districts to identify more special ed students. So when you look at the incidence of special ed around the state, it's pretty wide-ranging. That is, there isn't, a consistent practice for identifying special ed in all districts. This is county-level data, right? So it's averaged up from districts. And you can see it ranges from 7.6 to 16.8%, okay? Now, those are the outlying districts. The majority of districts fall within a couple of percent around the average, okay? But, so what we did is, I got the data on the count of special ed students by disability category for the two outlying counties, okay? Calaveras is the highest in the state. It was around 17%. And Tulare was the lowest in the state. It was around 7%. Pretty big difference, right? And as you can see, it's different in almost every category by a long shot, okay? And even in these areas that are kind of medically defined, you see big differences. So, this kind of suggests a couple of things. One is that identification practices are not standard across districts or even across regions, right? And that you do hold open the potential that if you base dollars on special ed counts, that you create funny incentives. And when you go talk to the people in Calaveras, you say, so what's going on in Calaveras that's different in other places? And they'll say, well, unfortunately, in our area, special ed is the gateway for providing services to kids who need special help. Whereas in California, in Tulare, they have several kind of steps before you get to special ed that try to get kids services without identifying them. So you'd be kind of rewarding Calaveras for this gateway approach, which many think isn't the right approach. Multi-tiered services, system of services is trying to have a system of services where special ed is one of many services that kids have access to. And so there's real practical reasons why going back to a count of special ed students, is something that you want to think pretty hard about. Are there other ways besides going back to counting special ed students for fiscal purposes to address this problem at the local level? Well, we did identify a couple options. One is that you can kind of reduce the problem of cost differentials in special ed. Special ed funding has been pretty flat, while base funding has gone up a lot with LCFF, right? So if you just said, well, if we give equal increases to the base and to special ed, then when things like wage increases occur, special ed has funding that can compensate at the local level for that increase. So you're not continuously kind of moving money over from the base into special ed because special ed's being treated the same way as the base. The other way is to say, maybe the state percentage of special ed cost ought to be fixed. And that what we would do is increase the special ed grant by whatever overall state spending increase was based on SACS data a couple of years ago. And that way, the state share wouldn't keep declining, but it would just stay constant at, right now, 31%. So I also want to emphasize, in our first report, we talk a lot about equalization, and that's, of course, a real important issue to districts, and something that's pretty hard to defend, having such unequal grants around the state. I didn't talk a lot about it in the second report because there wasn't a whole lot more to say. But that's an important part of going back to the AB 602 formula. On special education preschool, AB 602 doesn't do a good job of incorporating preschool costs because preschool students don't count as ADA, as students for attendance purposes. So if a district wants to make a big push to get more kids into preschool, it has to spend its base funds to do that, okay? And, you know, that's a much higher level of, you know, a test, you know, for all the competing purposes within districts that, you know, if you want to do the right thing, you're going to have to do it yourself, and there's not going to be any state participation in that. So, and one thing you can see, this is a cohort of kids who were age 6, I think it's in 16, 17, and you kind of track them back, that cohort back, and you can see how the cohort has grown since they were 3 years old, okay, and that how the number of kids who are being identified in each class grows pretty rapidly over this time period between age 3 and age 6. Actually, I have the cohort for the graduating class in 15, 16 going all the way back to age 3, and it even grows faster after this once they start getting into 3rd and 4th grade. But these are the kids that perhaps we could identify them early if we had systems for identifying them and if we funded them appropriately. Early intervention, it has shown to be really effective, especially for some groups of kids like autism. So it's really good to see autism has, you know, kids are getting into preschool. But I know over the weekend I saw some friends of mine and they were talking about their son who's a kindergarten teacher. This year he has 2 autistic kids in his kindergarten who weren't identified and weren't in any services. So, you know, there's more we can do in this area and that can really make a difference with kids. So how would you do that? You could count preschool students as an ADA. If they counted for a full ADA, that would be pretty expensive. And one of the things that the Special Ed Task Force in 2015, we have an author here in our audience who can, I'm sure, help us understand this better if there's more questions about it. But they recommended a grant on the order of about $4,000 per preschool student, which pencils out to something that is something relatively affordable for the state and something that could really, I think, help. You know, these kids aren't in school all day long, right? They have, depending on the kind of design of the local program and the nature of the kids' disability, are usually in for a part-day kind of a program. So, I won't go over the governance and accountability because I don't think they're on here. But just to note that we do have some fascinating topics in governance and accountability if you're interested in them. Okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. And now for the topic du jour, public pensions. Corey?
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Corey Quidell at University of Missouri. And I'm going to jump right into this talk since I don't have a lot of time. I should just mention Gabriel Gassman. I should give him lots of credit. He's a very sharp student with me at the University of Missouri who helped put this thing together. So I'm going to try and be very quick and just get through the big picture items in the report. There's a lot of details in the report. So I'm going to tell you what's happening with pensions, why it's happening, the longer term outlook, and if I get time, I'll talk a bit about the policy options. But all the stuff I breeze over will be in there in detail for folks who are interested. So the report's mostly about CalSTRS. So the public schools have workers in 2 types of plans. CalSTRS is the plan for certified personnel, so that's teachers, principals, administrators, that sort of thing. I'll try and stand over here. And then there's also classified employees. Those are the other workers in the schools. Both plans have substantively very similar problems. CalSTRS is the bigger cost item for school districts, so we focus mostly on CalSTRS in the report. And the stuff I'm going to show you is all from CalSTRS. So the way the system works is they have a pension cost. Every year it's an annual cost. It's a combination of cost to pay for current worker benefits, and then to pay for any debt, or in principle there could be a surplus the plan has from past plan operations, and that operationalizes on a per head basis. And so the actuaries figure out what % of salary per worker needs to be contributed to the fund in a given year to pay for whatever it is they need to pay for. And as most of you know, these rates are going up. In California, there are 3 different groups of payers. There's school districts, the state of California itself makes a contribution, and then employees. In this case, we're mostly talking about teachers here. So Assembly Bill 1469 is the legislation that really put the current big rate increases into place, and it's a phased-in increase over a 7-year or 8-year period here from 2014 to 2021. I think it's 7 years, because this is the year before anything happened. And just to give you a sense, so districts were the ones that were hit hardest by the direct legislation. So their contributions are going from 8.25% of teacher salaries to 19.1% by 2021. So that's more than a 100% increase in pension costs. Contributions for all 3 groups are going up. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. And then I think this is where I talk about there's more than one plan. Okay, so here's 2 graphs. They're actually very similar. This is showing you the contribution rates to CalSTRS from 2006 through 2021. And then I extend a little further here that I'll explain in a minute. So first, the chart on the left, these are the directly legislated increases by Assembly Bill 1469 that were passed in 2014, ending in 2021 at least. So I go back a ways. I started in 2006, and you can see the contributions are flat. The full bar is the total contribution, and sorry, that's kind of small in the back. The colors are for the 3 contributing parties. So employees are in the bottom in blue, orange is the school districts, and then gray is the state contribution. And so you can see, if you sort of look, start in 06, then jump to 2021, you can see rates for everyone. Rates are going up for everyone. The biggest increase, those orange bars are growing by the most. That's the school district contribution. And then the state is next, and employees, it's going up a little bit. The total increase is going from 18.3% of salary to just over 35%. So a near doubling of the contribution cost. That's direct legislation. So what happened with Assembly Bill 1469, as of 2014, this is what the actuaries said they needed. They were going to solve this problem. I'll talk in a minute. The time horizon for this was supposed to be till 2046, that we'd have these contribution rates. And it should have been enough. As I will talk about briefly, and I've been getting Q&A a little bit, the actuaries have not been particularly accurate. As an empirical statement, historically speaking, they are wrong, and they're consistently wrong in the same direction. And that's what the second chart is showing. There were provisions put into Assembly Bill 1469 in the event that the actuarial calculations were showing more money would be needed. There are flexible rates that all 3 groups have to pay for different reasons that can raise the cost further. The state is most at risk for those kind of flexible increases. So this other bar is like the current actuarial projection of the rates we'll need through 2046. And what that says is I added the state, what I call the state variable rate in this yellow here. And so that's kicking in at the maximum allowable increase by the bill every year for 7 consecutive years. And now we're closer to requiring about 38, almost 40% of teacher salaries, and that could change again at the next actuarial evaluation. There's a few little fluctuations in here, but the big thing is the state rate is going up further. So this is a big expense. Okay, so that's the what. Here's the why. If I had to give a 2-word answer, the why is pension debt. And so the slightly longer answer is there's a lot of different things going on. If this was a room full of pension wonks, we could talk all day about the different assumptions that are going on. There's 2 big things that you need to know. One is California has been underpaying what the actuaries say they need for a very long time. So the actuaries do all these calculations as to how much money they need. It's like getting a credit card bill, and California was like, we're not going to pay that. Okay, and that's all the contributing parties were doing that. We can argue about whose fault it is, but certainly no one was jumping up and down saying we need to pay our share when we weren't paying it. So it wasn't being paid. And so one reason, so now we're seeing these big cost increases. We're like, whoa, why is this so expensive? Well, one reason is we weren't paying the full price. Right? It's like getting DirecTV in the first year's half price, and then it goes up. Yeah, look, got more expensive, and that's because now you're paying the full price. You were not paying what you were supposed to be paying. And so just to give you a picture of that, so this is another chart which is similar, showing the contribution rates. It's again in percentage points of teacher salaries. Now the purple bars here match these old bars I was showing you. The purple bars on this chart match the left, what's been contributed, and the green bars are what the actuaries were saying they needed. Okay, and I start in 06. If you go back further, it's the same deal. So every time the green bar is bigger than the purple bar, we're underpaying what the actuaries say they needed to fund the plan. Even these gaps are non-trivial. even way over here on the left. We could talk offline or during the Q&A about what's happening here, but there's all kinds of reasons that these actuarial calculations are very volatile, and there's assumption changes, things like that. In some states, the purple bars and green bars are legislatively stuck together, and Assembly Bill 1469 actually did that in California, but prior to Assembly Bill 1469, the green bars can do whatever they want, the purple bars don't have to respond. And so when this jumped up, we started accumulating this huge debt. I carry this only through 2017 just because I don't like projecting out the actuarial calculations because they're so volatile. But what you can see is even as of now, when we're in this phase and we're still not paying what the actuaries say they need. So we're still accruing debt even though we're paying a lot more. Okay, why is this happening? Part 2. Even if we paid what the actuaries say they need, there's plenty of evidence that we wouldn't have enough money. So there are many states that have paid everything the actuaries said they need, and they still have this big debt problem. And so the bottom line is the actuaries assume a very high rate of return on assets. And California has been trying to make headway on this, and that's one reason these green bars are jumping around, not the only reason, but one of them. They're trying to lower the assumed rate of return. But just to give you the basic sense of how this works, Susanna mentioned it, but basically, they take in a bunch of money now for all the workers, and then they're figuring they need to take enough in to pay them whatever they promised them 30 years from now. So the assumed rate of return on the assets makes a big difference for how much they think they need. If they have a really high assumed rate of return, that interest compounds for 30 years, they don't think they need very much money right now to pay for a retirement benefit they promised. But if that assumption doesn't come to fruition, then California is left holding the bill. So the issue here is that the actuaries are assuming a very high rate of return on assets, and if that's not met, the plan's going to accumulate debt. Right now, California is assuming a 7% return on assets. In between, when I wrote my report and this meeting, the Federal Reserve actually changed their accounting practices for measuring pension liabilities, and the Federal Reserve is assuming a 4% rate. In the paper, I talk a little about this. There's no right answer to what the right rate is. So they don't know either. The Federal Reserve doesn't know either, but 4% is what they use. The gap between 4 and 7% with compounded returns is enormous. It's a devastating gap. Okay, oops. Longer term outlook. Okay, so what's going to happen here? So under current law, assuming all the actuarial assumptions hold from here on out, the current actuarial report has it right. This is an issue through 2046. So we have all this huge debt payment, and we're going to pay this down to 2046. So those numbers I was showing you, the roughly 40% of teacher salaries, that's going to last through 2046. So point number one, this is not a short-term aberration. This is not going to go away anytime soon. If these actuarial projections are too optimistic, which all of the empirical evidence out there, in my opinion, suggests they probably are for a variety of reasons, we're going to either need even higher rates, or we're just going to be extending that 2046 time horizon. How am I doing on time? Okay? Okay, good. So I'll talk about policy options for just a second. So a big part of the report talks about policy options. And just to be very clear, I'm not supposed to give recommendations, and I'm very happy with that advice. So these are not recommendations, but it is useful to give a landscape of what's going on out there. Yeah, I don't have any recommendations. So this is not a California problem. States across the country have this problem, so we've got some documentation of this in a report we wrote a few years ago. All these plans are in bad shape. So there's a lot of stuff going on out there, and there's opportunities to learn and talk to and see what other states have done to deal with these kind of issues. Within the current pension structure, if we're going to keep this DB pension structure, there's only two options. We have to have even further benefit reductions and/or higher contribution rates. Because even with the 7% assumed rate of return, we're still going to keep accruing debt. If we want to stop accruing debt, we need less benefits, or we need more money. Those are the only two choices. A side issue here that's worth mentioning: California teachers are not in Social Security, and so there's some states that have that and use that as like a three-legged stool type thing. And you could imagine lifting some of the pressure off the system by enrolling teachers in Social Security. I mean, Social Security is not doing wonderful. In case so I don't want to get too excited about that. Like, we don't have this great shiny yacht to pick us up and take us to safety, but we could. I mean, there's that sort of thing is full. There's some advantages of that if you wanted to consider that. The plans so there's also a number of states in similar situations that have done things to reform their pension plans. And what they've done is they've shifted emphasis from this defined benefit structure to a defined contribution structure. And there's lots of different ways they've done that. There's nothing inherent to the DB pension structure that requires this debt buildup, but as a practical matter, it's what happens. And so some states have gotten rid of their defined benefit plans. Some states have given teachers a choice. Some states have introduced hybrid plans. There's different options out there. And so the report talks through what other states have done. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I spend a lot of my time in school districts every day, and these are the three hot button issues that I hear. Pensions. Remember when the new law and the rising cost of pensions came in? It was right at the beginning of the LCFF, and we got a lot of new LCFF dollars, but these rates ramped up pretty slowly. And now we're at full funding, and if we're in a COLA-only environment, the pension pressure is tremendous on local school districts. Special ed, also a big issue when I go to districts. We're seeing those local contributions going up dramatically. A lot of declining enrollment districts with growing special ed populations, and yet the formula is based on entire enrollment and then the inequity in facilities. So at this point, I'm going to invite my presenters up to the front of the room, and we're going to do some Q&A, any of those pent-up questions you have about any of the presentations. We'll go back and forth and let them answer. So who wants to start? Is there from CTA, Angela Sue. First question.
Facilities. This is clarifying. In the sources slide that talked about the, geo bonds, developer fees, and there was an other. So the question is certificates of participation in the other or somewhere else? Or
Cops are in the other.
Yeah, in the other. Okay.
Okay, there. Okay. Yes, cops are in the other.
And then was LA Unified pulled out of any of the data?
LA Unified was pulled out of all data. Thank you very
Okay,
much.
that's super important.
Yep, because all these are pupil weighted, so
Yes.
they would have really skewed everything.
That's what I was worried
So
about.
I actually also looked at if I pulled out the top 5,
Okay.
and that really didn't do anything.
Okay.
But LA actually invested a ton
Yes.
in the 2000s, and they do skew things a bit. But even leaving LA in there, it looks pretty much the same.
Okay, Dr. Kurz?
Yeah, on the school facilities, there's talk about another school facilities bond in 2020. So I have 2 questions. How would you revise the current school facilities?
Didn't you hear Corey?
If you were to run another proposition and you were the author, how would you write it? And there's also talk of combining into one big bond issue higher ed and lower ed education, and whether you know of any studies about whether the combination helps passage or not.
That's a great question. The second part's very interesting. As far as I know, almost every single statewide bond has been K through 12 and higher ed. So that's been the general focus, unless I'm missing a question on that end.
Yeah, most of them do combine them?
Yes, almost all of them in California's history have combined K through 12 through higher ed funding for their facilities bonds.
We haven't in recent years.
Well, the totals have been, so like, for example.
Yeah, they're all in the same vote, but then the
But
totals are separated.
But they're distributed very, very different.
Yes.
The K-12 is through one program, the school facility program, and the higher ed is through an entirely different structure. And it actually has a very different structure that is largely driven, or has a big component around knowing, to Eric's point earlier, which buildings on the campuses need the most repairs and upgrades. So to the first part of your question, which is, if we were the sole author, or I was the sole author of a bill, I mean, I think, what we found is that, particularly on the modernization, so we're not having a lot of new growth. So I would argue we probably don't need to emphasize new construction so much as we need to, as a state, emphasize modernization of existing schools. That's where the vast majority of children are. That's where the vast majority, I would argue, kind of need is out there. There certainly are pockets of new construction growth. We have to house those children. But anyway, I think what we found was real inequities in terms of the renovation or modernization of upgrading schools. So I think it's the state's responsibility to sort of even out those equities. And what, my center has been doing a lot of work on how other states do this. And one of the things that you find is that they very often have a wealth-adjusted formula that either takes into account property value, usually is a key point of that. Sometimes it's student characteristics and or median household income, or some measure of the local ability to pay. Because as you know, on facilities, it's very different. It's not the state basically dividing up all the dollars. It's really predicated on a system of locals contributing a large amount to that, largely in our state through local GeoBonds. So I would look at 2 things. I would look at a sliding scale formula based on wealth, and then I would probably revisit what we have, which is the first come, first serve. That is, if you get in line, you get funding. There's got to be some way. The state does not know right now whether or not it's giving, say, renovation dollars, modernization dollars out to the school buildings in the worst condition in the state, period. We just don't know.
Next
Long
question.
answer.
Yes.
Sophia Kwong, Timothy, Assemblymember Patrick O'Donnell's office. Jeff, I have a question about the inequity in terms of local revenues that are being, that districts are able to generate. How much or what percentage of that are due to rural districts and smaller districts that are unable to pass bonds because perhaps they only have a
Sure,
handful of
I didn't
families
show you
who have
that.
kids who go to school?
I didn't show you that picture. We've done it. But the bottom line is, I was surprised. So let me put that, I was surprised. I thought it was going to be big because I thought assessed values would be so correlated with rural status. There are different cities raise more money than rural districts, but the disparities are smaller than any of the disparities I showed you earlier. So those disparities are not as large, although they do exist.
Right. Yeah, because those are the ones that actually would get financial hardship under our current program, right?
Right, they would get financial, which would reduce those inequities.
Yeah. And then the second follow-up question is, I've just gotten broad general ideas of the proposal that you're coming up with, but, my question to you is, politically, how do we get past something that could generate winners and losers?
So I would leave that to the political expert in the back of the room.
I mean, how was that answered in the LCFF?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think Jeff is right. I will speak my mind. I agree with Jeff that I would really love to see state aid for school facilities in California become sensitive to assessed values. And doing that obviously has political ramifications. If you're giving wealthy districts now, let's say 5% on the dollar, and you're giving very poor districts 60, 70% on the dollar, that potentially has political ramifications. But we've seen in California voters being willing to redistribute dollars. They've done it in the past. A lot of the things I read your surveys all the time, suggest that they're still willing. So I'm actually optimistic that voters would be willing, wealthy voters in the state would be willing to say, yes, we can do our share, and we can let the state supply more money to more disadvantaged districts.
Okay, next question. Questions? LAO.
Ken Capon with the Legislative Analyst's Office. I wanted to ask you about the funding structure of CalSTRS. The system seems unique in that it was created to administer benefits for local employees, but it's funded through a direct contribution from the state, not just employers and employees. And the state is really directly involved in setting the rate. It seems kind of unique in California, and I was curious, are there any other pension systems that work that way? And do you have any thoughts on what the strengths and weaknesses of that kind of a funding approach might be?
Sure, so I'll say I don't think it's that unique. I mean, I think the central management of these funds is actually ubiquitous. All of the plans have this. I mean, for retiree health benefits, that's different, but for pensions, almost every teacher in the country, public school teacher, is in a state plan. There's a handful of municipal plans, but that's just, I can count on my hand. So in terms of centralized financing, that is not unique. The state contributing, there's a mix across the country. So there are some states where the state does not contribute. There's some states where the state does. There are states where normally the state doesn't contribute, but the state has come in and bailed it out. So I think the state's role is different in different places. So I actually don't think California is very unique. California is quite normal. I mean, one of the more unique things pre the new legislation was that the actuary rate wasn't tied to what was supposed to be contributed. That was more unique and in a way that allowed for some extra debt to accumulate. But even that happens. It's not like that's totally unique. So the situation is pretty similar, actually. Okay, yes.
Hello, Martha with AXA, Association of California School Administrators. So I'm kind of curious that I went to the first session downstairs on funding adequacy and the lack of resources, and we need $25 billion more for public education in California. Given that the three programs you talked about, special ed facilities and pensions, are sort of fixed cost, we don't get us, there's the bonds, the funding that goes and approaches on the LCFF-based target. I'm wondering if there was to be revenues in the future, did you explore whether it's important to keep these funds to be sort of that categorical that we have right now, the structure for those three programs, or putting it towards the base, LCFF-based grant? Because ultimately it's a zero-sum game, the same dollar amount. We would be seeing either a categorical for pensions outside of Prop 98 or within Prop 98. or district have the money and part of LCFF, but it's encroaching on the general fund. Any thoughts about that prioritization of dollars and how to eventually distribute to school districts?
Well, in our first report on,
The question is special ed facilities and pensions. It seems like we're paying for it out of the same bucket. Would it be wise to have a categorical fund with a dedicated stream of dollars for those programs?
Or do you raise the base grant, LCFF?
so I can say in our first report, we recommended that special ed funding get added into LCFF and just operate as a separate funding stream within LCFF, so that it would be, kind of like supplemental and concentration grants, right? Where you would get an amount for special ed, but it would be generated out of the formula. And because districts are already spending more than what we give them, it's not really necessary to have a categorical funding structure to it.
Yeah, well, in the case of facilities, I mean, a school district funds its facilities from sort of two pots of money, right? Maintenance and operations comes out of your LCFF dollars, but your capital dollars, which is largely what we looked at in the study, is like large-scale renovation, replacing heaters and coolers, or building entirely new schools. Those are capital dollars, which are totally separate from LCFF. But a few years ago, they did away with the categorical on the operating side to spend an X percent for what was called deferred maintenance, but essentially facility maintenance, right? And so that's actually easy to cut because you don't notice it right away. It takes a number of months, if not years, for it to accumulate, and the LAO did research into that, and they were cutting it. But what we found in a study that we did a couple years ago was that districts serving lower wealth children were spending more dollars per student on maintenance and operations, which we thought, oh, that's great, because they probably have older buildings, they probably didn't invest in. But then when we looked at the capital side, we said, oh, they're really sort of undercapitalized. They don't have enough capital dollars, so what we figured out, what we think is happening is they're sort of having to spend on emergency repairs and things out of their LCFF dollars because they really can't on the capital side. They just don't have the wealth, they don't have the voters, whatever it is. And so there is this relationship, I think, between those dollars out of LCFF and capital access, and it's tricky, yeah.
Okay, more questions? Jeff?
Jeff Ockar, Riverside County Office of Education. Question for Corey. I know it's in your full report, but could you quickly mention some states that have explored hybrid defined benefit, defined contribution plans?
Yeah, sure. So Washington State's an example. So they have a hybrid plan. I talked through their plan in my report. Utah has you can choose which plan you want to be into. Or, that was not good English. You can choose which plan you want to enroll in. You can choose either a defined benefit or defined contribution plan. There's an interesting quirk in there where if the defined benefit plan, which is what California has, if it gets underfunded, the teachers are going to have, the way the plan's written right now, the teachers are going to have to pay for it. And so it's like a 30-year horizon, but that will be very interesting politically when that comes down the road. Tennessee has a hybrid plan. Florida has a choice plan where you can choose, the teacher can choose a defined contribution or defined benefit plan. Kansas has a cash balance plan, which is a kind of a mix, a hybrid between a defined benefit and defined contribution. I'm missing any, let me see if I'm missing. I don't know what Connecticut wasn't featured in my report, but maybe they have
Just
some.
this year?
Okay, Connecticut's a brand new example, apparently sitting right next to me. But yeah, the thing is, this is such a problem in so many states. There's actually lots of examples of these states doing things, and so that I know those states I just named. They're all covered in my report, and I talked through how they did it and the costs and all that stuff.
Thank you.
More Rob?
Corey, building on that, it seems there's two parts of this challenge. One is the existing debt obligation, and one is the ongoing benefits package. Do states tend to separate those two issues when they, so basically of your 36%, kind of half of that would be to pay for the existing debt, and half of it's paying for the benefits that are accruing. Do they separate those two as they try and challenge it, and are there different solutions for the two sides?
Yeah, so the context Rob is giving, so right now we're going to get up to about 36% or 38%. When we get there, about half of that is just debt cost. about it. So currently this year, the actuaries were saying they needed 18% of teacher salaries just to pay down their current debt by 2046. And then there's this also constant, cost of new benefits for current benefits for current workers. And the question is, are they separating those out in the accounting of these things? I guess my quick answer based on the states I know is no, they're not. So they're essentially levying that debt cost on a per head basis still, so like Washington, whether you choose the hybrid or not. So that in the hybrid plan, the teachers have part defined benefit and part defined contribution. And even those hybrid people, even though their defined benefit is much lower than the full defined benefit, their debt cost per head is still operationalized at the same price. And so the plan is seeing this huge debt and paying it down on a per head basis is still the main way of doing this, I think is the way to answer your question.
Any more questions? If not, Mr. Van Waring will assist me. What we're going to do is break up into 3 groups. If you're interested in pensions, that'll be one group, maybe the back quarter back there, as Rob shows you. Maybe special ed over here and facilities up front. We'll have our content experts help facilitate the discussion, and I'll put up the topics for the questions to be asked. So let's see.
Thank you. Great job.
Oh, you actually did your stuff.
Oh, yeah, no, I got.
Good. Good.